This video is looking at content analysis, which is a research method that is sometimes employed by psychologists to analyse qualitative data. So psychologists may choose to conduct experiments, observations, self-reports, correlations, or case studies, and content analysis is another method that they may use when dealing with qualitative data. So there's growing recognition in the field for the importance of analysing qualitative data and how useful it can be. Previously, it was a research method that was mostly used in other social sciences like sociology and anthropology, but it's becoming increasingly more common in psychology too. So, content analysis involves looking at qualitative data and turning it into numerical data, so quantifying it, and therefore this allows us to potentially statistically analyse it. So we're analysing qualitative data in a systematic way so that we can perform inferential testing and draw conclusions from that data. Now, remember, when we're talking about qualitative data, we're talking about non-numerical data. So this includes different forms of communication. So the forms of communication that are subject to content analysis are really wide-ranging. So we've got spoken interactions like conversations, speeches, interviews, written forms of communication, so texts, emails, and broader examples from the media as well. So newspapers, magazine articles, TV shows, advertisements are all subject to content analysis. We've also got some interesting things as well. There was a content analysis conducted recently on graffiti and looking at the different ideas and images that are created by both female and male graffiti artists. And also psychiatrist case notes can also be subject to content analysis. There was a very, very interesting study that just came out today, actually, and it was a content analysis of Trump's speeches from the 6th of April to the 24th of April. So all of his daily White House briefings on coronavirus. And they did a content analysis that was breaking down the number of minutes he had spoken about various issues. And the main finding was that he spent 45 minutes on average praising himself and his administration, 2 hours attacking other people, so opponents, China, the World Health Organization, etc., and less than 5 minutes offering condolences to victims of the pandemic. So that's a really useful content analysis because we can clearly see the priorities of the president there. And we've done that by breaking up qualitative data, his speeches, and quantifying it, turning it into numerical data so that we can see the statistical difference between how much time he's spending praising himself, attacking others, and condoling the victims, sending condolences to the victims. All right, so how do we actually perform a content analysis? The method involves 5 steps. So the first thing you need to do is become familiar with the data. So this involves obviously collecting the data. So in the case of the example I've just given you, it would be an example of watching all of the speeches of President Trump. It would be useful as well often to create a transcript, although in this case it may not be necessary. So the first step is to become familiar with the data by reading or watching it. The next step is to create categories from that data. So we need to ensure that they're relevant and that they include everything. And ideally, we want little overlap. So, for example, the categories that the researchers in the Trump example came up with were praise, attack, and condolences to the victims. So they're the different categories that came out of the speeches. So then the third step after you've created your categories is to create a coding system in the form of a grid. So in this case, their coding system, they might have acronyms that stand for the different categories that they came up with. So PR might stand for praise, ATT for attack, and VCT for victims. And they'll just put this into a very simple grid, which I'll draw up on the screen for you now. So it would just be something like PR for praise, attack, and condolences to the victims. So we've got here a grid with our categories there. The next step then, number 4, is to go through the data and tally the number of times a category arises in the data set. So every time, or for every minute in this case, that Trump is talking about opponents and attacking them, they'll tally that there in the chart. More on this in the next video of how you would actually conduct this, but generally you're just tallying the number of times that category arises in the data set. And then the final step is going to be to make any comparisons. So in this case, it's making comparisons between the topics that Trump spoke about. But other comparisons might be between males and females. Or I've seen examples of the number of leads in Disney films, whether that's male or female. And so really the comparisons is just based on your topic of research interest. When you have a look at this method and you have a look at the various steps, you'll see that it's not that different actually to an observational study. We need to create categories. In the case of observations, they're behaviour categories. We create a coding system and we tally the number of times we sample that data. And this is because a content analysis is a type of indirect observational research. And so the steps for conducting it are very, very similar, except this time, rather than observing behaviour, you're looking at qualitative data and you're observing like categories of behaviour within that communication. All right, so strengths and limitations. In terms of reliability, so when done well, content analysis follows a systematic procedure that can be replicated by other researchers, which means that often it does yield results with high reliability. So, for example, the Trump content analysis, it'd be very easy for another researcher to do that same analysis. They've got access to the same data, the same speeches, they know the categories, and they know the process for conducting the content analysis. So they would be able to conduct the same analysis and to check the reliability of those findings to see if there's consistency between their rating of Trump's speeches and the original researchers. It allows statistical procedures to be possible. So quantitative data itself lends itself to inferential testing. So we can see if there are any significant findings. In this case, any significant findings in the content of Trump's speeches. And content analysis is also highly flexible. So you can conduct a content analysis at any time, in any location, and at relatively low cost. So all you need is access to the appropriate sources, and they're often already in the public domain, for example, the Trump speeches. So because of this, it allows us to circumnavigate many of the ethical issues that we normally associate with psychological research. The limitations, though, there is the illusion of objectivity. So content analysis almost always involves some level of subjective interpretation. And we know that this can affect the reliability and the validity of the findings and conclusions. All researchers have preconceived biases that they bring to the research and they bring to this process, whether that's in creating the categories or in actually sampling them and tallying the number of times they appear. That is going to be somewhat subject to the bias of the researcher. So you just need to be aware of that. It can also be really reductionist as well. So if you're just focusing on the minutes speaking on a particular topic or the number of words or phrases spoken in isolation, this can be sometimes overly reductive. So it's disregarding often the context and the nuance and ambiguous meanings, and we lose some of the richness of the data. So for example, a tennis match, if you just hear the score at the end, yes, you're going to know who won and by how much, but you're going to lose everything in between. So you're not going to know how long the rallies lasted or how fast the serves were. And so sometimes turning qualitative data into quantitative data loses that richness. Content analysis is often time-consuming, so to manually code large volumes of text is extremely time-consuming and is quite often difficult to automate. So having to familiarise yourself with hours and hours of speeches, then having to create categories and tally for every minute of that speech, for example, can be very, very difficult. And finally, sampling bias. So how you select your content may produce bias. So in the previous research we looked at, they were analysing Trump speeches from the 6th of April to the 24th of April. Now we have to question why they chose those particular dates. Maybe on the day before that, maybe on April 5th, Trump spent his entire White House briefing dedicated to sending condolences to the victims. So we have to question the sampling of the material there. Likewise, if you're performing a content analysis of different newspaper articles, then you need to be aware of the biases that are inherent within those newspapers. So an analysis using articles from The Guardian is going to yield very, very different results to articles sampled from the Daily Mail. So you need to be aware of your own biases when performing a content analysis, but you also need to be aware of the biases that may be inherent within the data itself.